I'm standing here on Potsdamer Platz on a particularly grey and cold first, let us say, winter day of 2023. The hustle of an ordinary Monday morning. It's very difficult to imagine that just a few decades earlier, this part of Berlin was an empty, massive, open, weeping wound, which was the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall literally ran right through the center of Potsdamer Platz. And to get a sense of the profundity of this, you've got to imagine that Potsdamer Platz was, in actual fact, the commercial and cultural hub of Berlin, all the way up until 1939, right through even till the end of the war. But its heyday was the 1920s, when, as you can see over there, the first traffic light in Europe, in a European city, was installed to deal with the hubbub, the chaos of all of the trams and buses and the carts and the pedestrians, etc., that swarmed through the center of this wild Weimar Berlin of the 1920s. And to see the storm clouds of Europe gathering over this square in the 1930s, the Nazis come to power. They turn one of the buildings here, Columbia House, into one of their threatening torture chambers where they deal with political adversaries and Jewish victims of their race hate in the worst possible ways, darkening but not putting out the light of Potsdamer Platz, because of course at the same time there was still a real sense of its commercial hubbub, the excitement of the place, even as those storm clouds gathered. But by the end of the Second World War, this place was a desolate emptiness, bombed to pieces. And before there was any real chance of a reconstruction, the city was divided first into the four quarters of the Allied occupation and then the two halves of the city that belonged once to East, once to West Germany. And the wall came right through here. You can see a little mark on the ground here. If you look down, you'll see it, the path of the wall. In front of me is the East, behind me is West. And to give you a sense of how profound this transformation is, I want you to imagine Times Square, New York, a very famous image that most of us have a sense of. Times Square, New York, suddenly empty, suddenly divided by a wall, suddenly a wasteland. And the hauntedness of this place still remains, even though you have essentially a kind of commercial heartland here again. There is still, if the wall is gone and they rebuilt it like this, is the hauntedness gone? And I would argue no. When you stand here on this windswept plaza as we're standing today, it's full of tourists, lots of people moving around, but there is still a strangeness to the buildings, a strangeness to the space, a sense of otherness here that can only really be explained away by the artificiality of the reconstruction. In other words, what do I mean? I mean that this was empty because of the Second World War, the horror of that final battle, and the years of division with the Berlin Wall. And that emptiness, when the wall fell, had to be filled from scratch. So it's so incredible that you even have, for example, in the construction of the square in the 1990s, the first thing they have to do is dig a huge lake, as though they had to somehow clean the place of its wounds. And that had a very practical reason. The reason was that the water table in Berlin is very high, 1 meter down, so any major reconstruction or construction involves a complicated process of sucking water out and sending it to the canals. But in a sense, the fact that this was the largest man-made lake in Berlin for quite a number of months, 4 months, and that the foundations of the square in the 1990s was laid essentially by builders who had to dive to lay those foundations, seems to me to suggest something very beautiful metaphorically about the kind of attempt to create a new center for reunited or reconstructed Berlin. And the result was, as always, as cold as this square is today. This is the point. Berliners were not turned on by this new construction. They were not interested in it. And so an extraordinary PR campaign was launched by the builders who were attempting to sell this new place to people, to convince them that this was an adequate new quarter for the new reunified Berlin. And this was a process that ended with the Crane Ballet of 1997. The Great Reconciliation, the attempt to sell the new Potsdamer Platz to a very unimpressed Berliner crowd, was solved in a peculiarly Berlin way. Hubris, drama, humor, beauty, and an acknowledgement, essentially, that something has to be done to convince people that this strange, empty new place that's built on the ruins of the old Berlin that was wiped out by the Second World War and that was haunted by the Berlin Wall for 28 years, that this place has to be convincing to the people who live here and not just the tourists who visit. Even tourists who come here will argue or comment on the slightly windswept, empty feeling one gets here. Nevertheless, this grandiose plan was called the Crane Ballet, and it took place in 1997 at the height of the building of Potsdamer Platz. By this stage, these buildings here behind me, which by Berlin standards are actually very high, were almost completed, and most of Berlin was complaining that this was going to just be a soulless, commercial, empty place, a kind of headquarters for corporate Berlin, corporate New Germany. At the same time, you must picture this extraordinarily complicated building site. There's an immense amount of reconstruction going on. The lake's been closed up, but the foundations have been laid, but still they're building. There's a forest of cranes on the square, and these cranes are now brought into this great advertising campaign for the new Potsdamer Platz. So the great and the good of Berlin are invited to viewing platforms in 1997 in the summer on the top of these buildings. They're not told what's going to happen. And then the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, Daniel Barenboim, stands up on a platform and directs the cranes, who have all their crane operators sitting in the boxes, sitting in their cabins. He directs these crane arms to move to Beethoven's 9. And this extraordinary music breaks on the square and the crane arms move. And the people watching are begeistert, that wonderful German word that speaks to joy and pleasure and charm. They were utterly charmed by this. Was it ultimately completely successful? Is Potsdamer Platz a beloved place in Berlin? No. There is still here what most people would say an empty commercial feeling, and that it's just for tourists. But I personally think this goes deeper, that emptiness that they've left here in the construction is important because it remembers, whether you know it or not, another kind of emptiness that ruled here, that reigned here after the Second World War, and when the years that the Berlin Wall was up. A netherland, a no man's land, a nothingness at the heart of a city that blew up the world in 1939. And the wound of that continued to weep right through the period of division, right up until reconciliation, reunification. And so for me, the enduring emptiness here is more honest than something that would be packed and full and energetic. We need the empty spaces in Berlin to remember the hauntedness of this place. Thank you. One of the things that happened when the Berlin Wall came up was that Berlin was divided into two in a way that was permanent. So in other words, from 1949 to 1961, there was still a fair amount of movement between the two halves of the city, Communist East Berlin and West Berlin that belonged to West Germany. People could cross over the boundary easily to go shopping, visit friends, family. And this was very important because the division of Berlin was never actually an equal division. The Soviets got to Berlin first. They were responsible for the initial sort of territory taking in the city, and they made sure that they occupied the most important historical heart of the city, which included the Museum Island, for example. Now, Museum Island is where all of the great museums, or many of the great museums of Berlin are. And this was something that West Berliners still used in the 1950s. They would cross the boundary line into East Berlin. There was no wall, you didn't have to show your papers, and they would go to the Museum Island, for example. When the wall comes up, the division becomes permanent in a way that is much more aggressive, and people are no longer free to move around. And a strange game begins, which one of my colleagues refers to as the creation of Berlin. In other words, the two Berlins that develop after the wall comes up, whereby the lost cultural heartland of East Berlin is replicated in West Berlin in a very artificial way. And what do I mean by artificial? I mean, if you look behind me, if you look at the Berlin Philharmonic behind me here, you see the strange tooth-like towers or horn-like towers of Potsdamer Platz rising up there. All of this is very new. This whole area here, including the St. Matthias Kirche, Mies van der Rohe's new National Gallery, and Hans Scharoun's famous state library, which we sometimes call the submarine. These buildings were built in a very contrived way. And what do I mean by that? This was the answer to the cultural wasteland that was West Berlin after the Berlin Wall comes up in '61, when the movement between the two sides of the city is no longer free. And it wasn't just about replicating the institutions of East Berlin, like Museum Island. It was also about building a space that told people that the system here was better in the West, that this was a more modern, more open, more adventurous, less dark, less controlled, less monumental kind of world. And so when they created this, what was called the Culture Forum, in German the Kulturforum, they were essentially replicating the 19th century Museum Island, but they were doing it in a very, what was considered modern way. At that time, we're talking now about the mid to late 60s. The first building to come up is this building here, which is the Philharmonic, designed by Hans Scharoun. They sometimes called it the Bedouin tent. A very strange building. Odd angles, odd color, very different to the big formal buildings you usually associate with a Philharmonic, especially one as prestigious as Berlin. The reality is this was a provocation. This was a way of saying, look how free and easy and exciting and new we are in the West. Furthermore, the building, this first one, was built facing away from Potsdamer Platz. Now, Potsdamer Platz is where you can see those two horns, the buildings rising up. Why was the building facing away from Potsdamer Platz? Because they were essentially saying, we are turning our backs to the Berlin Wall, this evil, coercive, horrible structure that marches through the center of Berlin, that stops free movement. And after the Philharmonic came up, they then built the library, they built the Kulturforum here, the Gemälde Gallery. All of these museums were meant to create a cultural heartland to West Berlin, but also to embody something very important, which was a kind of heterogeneity. And what I mean by that is that each of the buildings looked different, was differently shaped, differently spaced. The implication was that Western capitalist society encouraged experimentation, openness, modernness, lightness, humor, whereas the building projects that were going on in East Berlin were these big, heavy, monumental buildings that were designed to look like Moscow. And so every single aspect of this space was a kind of, essentially an act of opposition to what was going on in East Berlin. Now, it's very interesting. You have to ask yourself from the perspective of 2023 how successful this was. And I would say that basically it was a failure. And what I mean by that is people come here to the Kulturforum to consume culture. They come to the galleries, they of course come to the Philharmonic, they come to the new National Gallery, the students study across at the library, but it is not a place through which people move en masse. It's not a feeling that you'll get in other places in the city that feels organic, that has energy. It feels very empty in actual fact. And they are still trying to fix the problem of the inorganicness of this place Here behind me, you can see they're building a new modern art museum, even right next to the great behemoth that is Mies van der Rohe's new National Gallery, which shows modernist painting from the 20th century. In other words, guys, they are still trying to make this place work. Recently, a few summers ago, a lot of kids started skateboarding here in the summer. And in actual fact, when there were 20 or 30 kids skateboarding here, it was the most alive I'd ever seen this place, which I think is very interesting, and certainly not meant to be a skateboarding park, but was perfect for skateboarding. The thing is, this is my argument about the Kulturforum. In the same way that I mentioned on Potsdamer Platz that there's a certain kind of windswept emptiness there, this is even more particularly windswept and empty. It doesn't have the energy of a real city quarter because it was built in a moment whose ideology has passed. In other words, it was built to turn West Berlin into a cultural capital in opposition to East Berlin. It was built to be a sort of critique of the Berlin Wall, which was literally half a kilometer away from us. And then what happens is the wall falls, the Iron Curtain falls, the Soviet Union falls, Berlin reunifies, Germany reunifies, and suddenly Berlin's got two of everything. And it's not that it's too much, it's that the meaning of certain places have disappeared. And this is the reason, my personal theory on why the Kulturforum continues to fail as a place is because its meaning is lost on people now. They come here, they don't necessarily know why it is, why it's so strange, why the buildings are, frankly, by modern standards, quite ugly, why it's sort of empty all the time, what its purpose is. And again, it comes back to the hauntedness that I spoke to you about in the previous stop at Potsdamer Platz. The enduring strangeness of Berlin, built to match ideological moments after the Second World War, that when they passed, when they were ended, were emptied of their meaning. And people can feel that. They can feel when they're in a place that its meaning is lost somehow now. Once again, not to say that this is in any place a place that doesn't work, in the sense of the actual institutions here are very high quality. But the communal sense of the space is where that emptiness lies most profoundly, and where you get the sense once again that Berlin is ultimately and enduringly still scarred by the emptiness of the end of the Second World War, by the occupation and division, by the long dark winter of the Berlin Wall, and now finally by the strange reconstruction that we see around us that still can't entirely bury that past or close every gap or create noise where every silence still lingers.